Racist man punches little black girl in a park, speechless when her dad, the chief of police, arrives. The sun was warm and golden that afternoon, shining down on the neighborhood park as if it had been painted with light. Children filled the air with laughter as they ran around the swings and slides, their voices mixing with the sound of birds chirping in the nearby trees. Parents sat on benches, talking quietly, watching their kids, and enjoying a rare moment of peace in a busy world. Among all the children, one little girl stood out. She was full of life, her curly hair bouncing as she skipped across the grass, her shoes hardly touching the ground. She carried a small pink ball with her, tossing it up and catching it, her giggles ringing out every time she missed and had to chase after it. She was the kind of child who made people smile just by being around. Strangers who passed by couldn't help but notice her bright energy. She had a way of running that made it look like she was dancing, as if the world itself was her playground. Her joy was innocent, pure, and untouched by the heaviness of adult life. For her, the park was a place of magic. Every tree looked like it could hide a secret, every patch of flowers felt like it was waiting to be discovered. On the other side of the park sat a man, alone on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree. His posture was stiff, and unlike the other parents or visitors, his eyes weren't soft with amusement. Instead, he watched with a hardened gaze, his jaw tight as if something about the scene disturbed him. People nearby didn't pay much attention, he looked like just another park visitor, maybe someone taking a break or lost in thought. But inside, his thoughts were different. There was a bitterness about him, a weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders. The little girl, unaware of anyone watching her, kept running freely. She tossed her ball higher this time, clapped twice before catching it, and then squealed with happiness at her own game. A group of other children joined her, and soon there was a circle of laughter and shouts, all chasing the ball as if it were the most important thing in the world. They didn't care who was taller or shorter, older or younger. They just cared about fun. The man's eyes narrowed. Something about the girl drew his attention more than the others. Maybe it was her loud laughter, maybe it was the way she carried herself without fear, or maybe it was the fact that she stood out in the group. Whatever the reason, his mood grew darker as he sat there, gripping the edge of the bench with one hand. The little girl didn't see him. She was too busy playing tag now, her ball forgotten for the moment as she sprinted across the open space, her small legs moving as fast as they could. Her friends ran after her, shouting her name, trying to catch her. She looked over her shoulder and laughed, her face lit up with pure joy, not noticing where she was going. In her excitement, she tripped slightly and stumbled forward. To steady herself, she bumped into the man who was sitting on the bench. It was a light bump, the kind any child might cause when running too fast, and she immediately turned to apologize. Her big eyes widened, and she gasped softly. "Sorry, mister," she said in her sweet, innocent voice. Her small hands nervously clasped in front of her, but her smile was still gentle, as if she believed her apology would fix everything. For a moment, silence hung in the air between them. The man looked down at her, his face hard, while the girl tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to respond. She expected maybe a smile, maybe a simple "it's okay." That's what adults usually said when kids made little mistakes. She had no idea that this man carried something inside him that had nothing to do with her mistake. Around them, the park continued as normal. A mother pushed her toddler on a swing. Two teenagers shared an ice cream cone while laughing at each other's jokes. A jogger passed by on the trail, listening to music. No one noticed right away that something tense was building near the oak tree. The girl's friends had stopped running, standing a few feet away, watching curiously. They could sense that something wasn't right, though they didn't understand why. Children have a way of picking up on moods even when they don't know the words for them. One of them called out the girl's name softly, as if to warn her. The man finally shifted in his seat. He leaned forward, his shadow falling over her tiny frame. His eyes were sharp, unkind, filled with an emotion she couldn't name. The girl felt her heart beat faster, not from running now, but from the uncomfortable silence that seemed to wrap around her. She shuffled her feet nervously, clutching the hem of her dress, still waiting for a response. In that moment, the world around her seemed to fade a little. The laughter in the park didn't sound as bright. The sun didn't feel as warm. All she could focus on was the way this man was looking at her, as if she had done something much worse than simply bumping into him. The tension grew, invisible but heavy. Parents sitting nearby began to glance in their direction, noticing the girl standing there awkwardly in front of the man. They couldn't hear what was being said yet, but the scene looked unusual enough to draw attention. A mother on a nearby bench frowned, her instincts alerting her that this wasn't just a normal interaction between a child and an adult. The girl swallowed hard, still trying to be polite. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice softer this time, carrying a hint of worry. She thought if she explained herself better, maybe the man would smile, maybe he would forgive her quickly, and everything would go back to normal. But forgiveness didn't come. Instead, the man's expression tightened further, and his hands curled into fists on his knees. He didn't raise his voice, but there was something unsettling about the way he breathed out slowly, as if controlling something inside him. The girl didn't know what it was, but she suddenly wished her father were there. By now, more parents were watching, their conversations paused. Children whispered to each other, wondering why their friend hadn't come back to play. The park, once filled with carefree joy, seemed to hold its breath. Everyone could sense something was about to happen, though no one yet knew what. The little girl stood very still, unsure of what to do next. Her ball rolled away quietly, forgotten in the grass. She didn't chase after it this time. She only looked up at the man with wide eyes, hoping for kindness, but feeling a growing fear instead. And in that fragile moment, the peace of the park began to break, though no one could yet see just how much it would shatter. The little girl stood frozen in front of the man, her small frame almost trembling under his sharp stare. The world around them continued to move, but for her, time slowed down. She wished she could run back to her friends, yet her legs felt heavy, as if planted into the grass. A few feet away, her friends shifted nervously, whispering among themselves, their young voices filled with worry. The air in the park no longer felt light, instead, it carried a strange heaviness, the kind that made people uneasy without even knowing why. The man finally leaned back slightly, but his gaze never softened. He spoke in a tone that wasn't loud, but it carried enough sharpness to make the girl shrink back a little. His words, though not shouted, were filled with frustration, as if her little accident had disturbed something deep inside him. The girl's tiny hands gripped each other tightly, and she repeated her apology once more. "I didn't mean to," she said again, her eyes glistening. Nearby parents began to notice clearly now. They saw the way the girl's cheerful expression had disappeared, replaced with uneasiness. One mother stood up slowly from the bench, not wanting to intrude but unable to ignore the tension building between the two. Another father lowered the book he had been reading, his brows furrowed as he watched. The children on the swing slowed their play, curious about why everyone's eyes were turning toward the oak tree. The man shifted again, this time standing up from the bench. His tall figure seemed even more intimidating to the small girl. She took a step back instinctively, nearly stumbling. Her friends gasped softly, torn between running to her and staying where they were. Children often rely on adults to guide them in such moments, and they waited, hoping someone older would step in. The girl's voice was barely above a whisper now, but she tried one last time to explain. "I was just playing. I didn't see you." Her words, innocent and simple, should have been enough to melt anyone's heart. But instead of softening, the man's expression only seemed to harden further. He muttered something under his breath, words that made no sense to her but carried an edge that sent a chill through the atmosphere. By this point, several parents had risen from their seats. One mother walked closer, calling out gently, "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Her tone was warm and protective, and it gave the little girl a small sense of comfort, though she didn't dare move yet. The man, however, looked up sharply at the woman, his eyes flashing with irritation at being watched. The crowd's attention was now fully drawn. Phones came out quietly, not to escalate but to document, as many people these days felt the need to capture moments where something didn't feel right. The park, which just minutes earlier had been filled with cheerful noise, was now filled with a tense silence broken only by the murmurs of concerned voices. The little girl's lips trembled, and she bit down gently, trying not to cry. She wasn't used to adults looking at her this way. At home and at school, she was surrounded by people who encouraged her, who smiled when she laughed, who picked her up when she fell. But here was a grown man who didn't see her as a child at all, but as someone who had done something unforgivable just by accidentally bumping into him. Her friends finally gathered courage and walked closer, standing behind her like a little shield. One of the boys spoke up in a small but firm voice. She said sorry. It was an accident. His courage surprised even himself, but he couldn't just stand by anymore. The girl glanced back at her friends, her eyes filling with relief. She wasn't alone anymore. The man, however, didn't appreciate being challenged by children. His jaw tightened, and he muttered again, this time louder. The kids didn't understand every word, but they felt the coldness in his tone. It was enough to make them step closer together, forming a tighter group around the girl. By now, the mother who had spoken earlier came even closer, her hand resting on the girl's shoulder protectively. She crouched down to meet the child's eye level, whispering gently, "It's okay, honey. You're safe." Those words felt like a small ray of sunlight breaking through the heavy clouds. The girl's shoulders relaxed just a little, though her eyes still darted nervously toward the man. The man took a step forward as if to speak again, but before he could, another father stepped in, placing himself firmly between the man and the children. His voice was calm but strong. "That's enough. She's just a kid." His presence shifted the balance of the moment. The man looked irritated, but the crowd had grown larger now. People weren't going to let him frighten a child without saying something. The atmosphere had completely changed. The joyful park had turned into a quiet audience, watching every move. Parents were whispering to one another, children clung to their guardians, and the once free laughter of play had been replaced by a heavy stillness. The man seemed to realize he was now the center of attention, and instead of backing down, he crossed his arms defiantly, his expression stubborn. The little girl clung to the woman's hand now, finally letting her tears slip down her cheeks. She wasn't crying loudly, instead, the tears rolled silently, the way children sometimes cry when they're too confused to understand why they feel so hurt. She wanted her father. She wanted the comfort of his voice, the safety of his arms. But for now, she had the kindness of strangers holding her up. A man in the crowd finally pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice low but urgent. Others began recording more openly, knowing that this moment was not just about a little girl and a stranger, it was about something much larger. The park, a place meant for joy and family, had suddenly become a stage where deep truths about human behavior were being revealed. The man stood his ground, but the more the crowd grew, the less power he seemed to have. Every parent that stood around the girl, every phone that pointed in his direction, stripped away the confidence he had shown moments earlier. The whispers grew louder. Why is he treating her like that? She's just a child. Unbelievable. The little girl wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Even through her tears, she showed a quiet bravery. She didn't scream, she didn't hide her face, she stood there, holding onto the hand that comforted her, looking at the man with eyes that still held innocence, though now mixed with hurt. And just when it felt like the moment could not stretch any further, a sound came from the edge of the park. The crunch of footsteps on the gravel path, steady and purposeful, drew the attention of the crowd. People turned their heads to see who was arriving. The little girl's face lit up, despite her tears. She knew that walk. She knew that tall figure moving toward her with calm authority. Her heart leaped with relief. Her father had arrived. The sound of steady footsteps grew louder as the father made his way toward the crowd. His presence alone seemed to change the atmosphere in the park. People, who only moments earlier had been whispering in unease, now grew quiet in anticipation. There was something about the way he walked, calm, measured, but strong, that gave a sense of control to a situation that had been spiraling into chaos. The little girl's eyes brightened, and though tears still clung to her cheeks, her lips curved into a trembling smile. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Daddy." The man at the center of the tension turned his head toward the sound. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He hadn't expected anyone to arrive with such confidence, let alone someone connected to the little girl. He straightened his posture, his arms still crossed, trying to appear unfazed. But deep down, he sensed the shift that had just occurred. The father's first action wasn't to look at the man. He walked straight to his daughter, kneeling down immediately so that his eyes were level with hers. His voice softened in a way only a parent's voice could. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The girl nodded quickly, but her small body trembled as she threw her arms around his neck. He held her tightly, letting her know with that single embrace that she was safe now. The crowd that had gathered felt a wave of relief wash over them at the sight. There was something grounding about a parent arriving in that moment. The father stayed crouched for a while, speaking softly so only she could hear. "You did nothing wrong. You're brave, and you're safe now." The little girl clung to him, nodding into his shoulder, the weight of her fear slowly melting away. The other children who had stood protectively nearby stepped back slightly, comforted by his presence as well. They trusted that the situation was now in capable hands. When the father finally stood, he turned his attention toward the man. His expression changed completely, still calm, but with a firmness that carried authority. The man shifted uncomfortably, though he tried to mask it with a forced scowl. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, the crowd could sense that the balance of control had shifted entirely. Parents in the crowd watched closely. Many of them had seen the man act harshly toward the child, and they wanted to see how this confrontation would unfold. Some of them whispered, "That must be her dad," while others murmured about how different the energy felt now that he was here. Phones continued to record quietly, though no one spoke above a whisper, out of respect for the seriousness of the moment. The father stepped slightly closer, but his voice when he spoke was level, almost quiet, yet strong enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I need to understand something," he said evenly. "Why are you standing here making a little girl feel unsafe?" There was no anger in his tone, just a piercing steadiness that made the man falter for a moment. The man opened his mouth, ready to blurt out an excuse, but the words caught in his throat. Surrounded by so many witnesses, and facing a man whose presence radiated strength and control, his usual confidence seemed to shrink. He muttered something unclear, his eyes darting around at the crowd as if searching for someone to support him. But there was no support to be found. Every parent, every child, every passerby was against him now. The father didn't rush him, didn't shout, didn't make any sudden moves. He simply waited, standing tall with his daughter now holding onto his hand tightly. Silence stretched in the air, heavy but powerful. The man fidgeted, realizing that nothing he could say would undo what everyone had witnessed. Meanwhile, the crowd began to respond in small but significant ways. A mother called out firmly, "We all saw what happened. She didn't do anything wrong." Another added, She's just a child. You should be ashamed. The voices grew louder, not in chaos but in solidarity. The man's face turned red as he looked around, realizing the walls were closing in around him. The little girl pressed herself against her father's side, her eyes wide but calmer now that she was not alone. She looked up at him, sensing the quiet strength he carried. To her, he was not just her dad, he was her protector, her hero, the one person who could stand tall even when others tried to tear her down. The father raised a hand slightly, signaling for the crowd to calm. His leadership showed naturally, without needing to explain who he was. The murmurs quieted almost instantly, and all eyes were back on him. It was as if everyone knew instinctively that he was not an ordinary parent, that he carried authority beyond this moment. The man shifted again, trying to collect himself. She ran into me, he stammered, finally forming words. Kids these days, no respect. His excuse sounded weak, even to himself. The crowd reacted with disbelief, some shaking their heads, others sighing at the flimsy attempt to justify his behavior. The father looked at him steadily, letting the silence stretch again before replying. Children run. They laugh, they play, they fall, and they bump into people sometimes. That's what they do. Adults are supposed to know better. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that struck deep. The man's bravado seemed to crumble further. One child in the crowd whispered to another, "Her dad's not scared of him at all." And it was true. The contrast between the trembling little girl earlier and the calm authority of her father now could not have been more striking. The crowd began to move subtly, parents inching closer to form a protective half-circle around the little girl and her father. They didn't speak much, but their presence was loud enough. They were united in their stance, ready to back the father up if needed. The park had transformed into a community standing together against unfairness. The man, realizing his isolation, tried one last time to regain control of the situation. He pointed a finger toward the girl, his voice rising in defensiveness. People are overreacting. She bumped into me, that's all. I didn't do anything wrong. But the words sounded hollow in the air, especially after everything the crowd had seen. No one was convinced. The father simply shook his head, his face calm but disappointed. You don't have to admit it to me, he said softly. You'll answer for it soon enough. The man froze, his eyes narrowing as confusion flickered across his face. What did this father mean? Answer for it where? He swallowed hard, suddenly uneasy again. The little girl tugged on her father's hand gently. She didn't fully understand the details of what was happening, but she knew enough to sense that things were about to change even more. She whispered, "Can we go home, Daddy?" He leaned down and kissed her forehead. Soon, sweetheart. Very soon. The tension in the park hadn't vanished yet, but there was no doubt anymore about who was in control of the situation. The father's calm presence had turned the tide. The man who once looked untouchable now stood alone, surrounded by truth, by witnesses, and by a community unwilling to let him intimidate a child. And though the little girl's tears were still drying on her cheeks, her hand in her father's gave her the strength to stand tall again. What had begun as fear was slowly turning into a lesson for everyone present, that love, courage, and unity could overpower even the darkest of moments. The park was silent, except for the rustling of leaves in the soft afternoon breeze. The father stood calmly, his little girl's small hand wrapped tightly in his own. Around them, parents and children had gathered in a protective circle, their faces tense but hopeful. They sensed something powerful about this man, though they didn't yet know the full truth. The man who had caused all the trouble shifted on his feet, his earlier confidence fading with each passing moment. The father's steady gaze never left him. There was no shouting, no dramatic display. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His silence was stronger than any angry words could have been. The man looked around nervously, realizing that the entire park was against him now. Still, he muttered under his breath, trying to appear as though he didn't care. But his hands betrayed him, they twitched at his sides, restless and unsure. The little girl clung tighter to her father's hand, her eyes filled with trust. She felt safe now, but she could still sense the heaviness of the moment. She pressed her face briefly against his arm, hiding from the man's stare, and the father placed a protective hand on her shoulder. His first priority was always her comfort. He bent slightly and asked softly, "Do you want to sit down, sweetheart?" She shook her head quickly. She wanted to stay by his side. The crowd grew restless. Parents exchanged glances, some whispering about calling for help, others already aware that something was different about this father. One of the men in the crowd, holding his phone in his hand, leaned toward another parent and said quietly, "He's too calm. Look at the way he's handling this. He's not just anybody." The father finally took a step closer to the man. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm, carrying across the silent park, "You need to understand that this isn't just about today. What you chose to do will not be ignored." The man bristled at the words. He forced a laugh, though it sounded shaky. "Ignored? What are you talking about? Nothing happened here. You people are exaggerating. She bumped into me, and now everyone's making a big scene." But the crowd didn't agree. Murmurs of disapproval filled the air. A mother shook her head and said aloud, "We all saw what you did. Don't lie. Not in front of all these kids." Her voice carried courage, and others nodded in agreement. The man's eyes darted around, realizing there was no escape from the weight of all those witnesses. He tried to speak again, but the father raised a hand slightly, and the entire park grew quiet. There was something commanding in that gesture, something that told people he was used to being listened to. The little girl peeked up at her father, sensing that he was about to reveal something important. His voice was calm but carried authority that no one could ignore. "You don't realize who you're standing in front of," he said, his eyes fixed on the man. "I'm not just her father. I am the chief of police in the city." The words spread through the crowd like a wave. Gasps and whispers followed, and people exchanged wide-eyed looks. Suddenly, everything made sense: his composure, his calm strength, the way he carried himself with such confidence. This wasn't just a protective parent standing up for his child. This was a man who carried the weight of the law, a man used to facing conflict without fear. The man who had been so bold only moments earlier froze, his mouth slightly open in shock. His arrogance drained away instantly, replaced with disbelief. His eyes flickered to the badge now visible on the father's belt, the small but undeniable proof of his words. The man's face paled, and he stepped back instinctively. The father didn't move closer, didn't need to. His presence was enough. "When you choose to intimidate a child," he said steadily, "you aren't just making a mistake. You're showing the world who you truly are. And today, too many people saw the truth about you." The man opened his mouth to defend himself again, but no sound came out. The weight of the father's words, combined with the stares of dozens of witnesses, silenced him completely. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if the strength he once pretended to have had finally drained away. The little girl's friends, who had been standing nearby, whispered in awe to each other. "Her dad's the chief of police," one boy said, his eyes wide. "No wonder he wasn't scared." The children looked at the girl with new admiration. She wasn't just their brave friend anymore, she was the daughter of someone who protected the entire city. The father gently guided his daughter to a nearby bench, making sure she was comfortable. He knelt down again and spoke softly to her. "I'll take care of everything now, sweetheart. You don't need to worry anymore." She nodded, her trust in him absolute. Turning back to the man, the father's expression hardened once more. "You will be held accountable for what you did," he said firmly. Not because I'm angry as a father, but because no child should ever be treated the way you treated her. His words resonated deeply, not just with the man, but with everyone present. Parents nodded, some even wiping tears from their eyes, moved by the dignity in his voice. A few moments later, two uniformed officers arrived, having been called earlier by one of the bystanders. When they saw who was already there, they immediately understood the situation. They greeted the chief with respect and waited for his instruction. The man's face turned pale as he realized the seriousness of the situation. He stammered weakly, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding. But his words carried no weight anymore. The crowd had seen too much, and the truth was undeniable. The chief nodded at the officers, who stepped forward calmly. Take his information, he instructed. We'll make sure this is handled properly. There was no anger in his tone, only professional firmness. The man tried to protest, but the officer's steady presence silenced him quickly. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. Parents comforted their children, telling them it was all right now. The tension that had gripped the park for so long began to ease, replaced with a sense of justice being restored. People put their phones away, though some still watched closely, knowing they had witnessed something powerful. The little girl leaned against her father as he returned to sit beside her. She whispered softly, "Are you mad, Daddy?" He shook his head gently, kissing her forehead. "No, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. You were strong. And now, everything is going to be okay." The park slowly returned to its rhythm. Children cautiously went back to the swings and slides, though their eyes still glanced toward the chief and his daughter with admiration. Parents whispered about the strength and calm they had just witnessed, some even feeling comforted knowing that a man like him was leading their city's police. The man who had caused all the trouble sat silently now, his earlier defiance completely gone. He avoided the eyes of the crowd, unable to face the weight of his actions. For once, he had no words. The chief rested his hand on his daughter's back, steady and reassuring. He didn't gloat, didn't smile in triumph. For him, this wasn't about proving power, it was about protecting his child and sending a message that kindness and respect must always prevail. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the park, that message was clear to everyone who had been there. No matter how dark a moment may seem, courage, love, and justice have the power to shine brighter. The man sat quietly on the bench now, no longer the bold figure he had been earlier. His shoulders were slouched, and his eyes darted nervously between the crowd and the two uniformed officers who stood nearby. The playful noise of the park had slowly returned, but the area around the oak tree still carried a certain heaviness. Parents kept their children close, whispering about what they had just seen, while others simply watched the chief with quiet admiration. The little girl rested against her father's side, holding onto his arm tightly. Her tears had dried, and her breathing was calmer now. She felt safe in his presence, and though the memory of fear lingered, her heart was steady again. She looked up at him with wide eyes and whispered, "Can we go home now?" The chief bent down, brushed a strand of curly hair from her face, and smiled gently. "Soon, sweetheart. Just a little longer. Daddy needs to finish something important first." He stood up again, his tall frame commanding attention without effort. The officers looked to him for direction, and the crowd waited in silence, curious about what he would do next. He didn't rush. He wanted his daughter and everyone else there to understand that true strength wasn't about shouting or anger, it was about control, calm, and fairness. The man finally tried to speak, his voice weak and unsure. "Listen. I didn't mean for things to go this far. I didn't mean to upset anyone." His words stumbled out awkwardly, lacking the confidence he once displayed. The crowd wasn't impressed. Parents shook their heads, unimpressed with his attempt to excuse himself. The chief looked at him steadily. His tone remained calm, but every word carried weight. "What you did today matters," he said firmly. "A child came to this park to laugh and play. Instead of treating her with kindness, you chose to frighten her. You didn't think anyone would say anything. But they did. And now you have to face that." The man opened his mouth again, but the chief lifted a hand gently, and he fell silent. The crowd admired that control. Without raising his voice, the chief commanded attention in a way that no one else could. It wasn't just because of his badge or title, it was because of the respect he had earned through his calm authority. The little girl watched her father closely. She admired how he stood tall and strong, yet never once lost his temper. To her, it was proof that being brave didn't always mean fighting loudly. Sometimes, bravery was quiet. Sometimes, it was standing firm without fear. The officers stepped closer, taking down the man's details as instructed. He fidgeted, uncomfortable under their watch, but he didn't resist. He knew he was in no position to argue anymore. The chief continued speaking, not just to the man, but to everyone gathered. "Every parent here knows what it means to protect their child. Every child deserves to feel safe in a park like this. What happened today reminds us how important it is to stand together when something isn't right." The crowd nodded, some parents clapping softly in agreement. The chief's words weren't just for justice, they were a lesson. He was teaching not through anger but through example. His daughter listened intently, understanding more than she had earlier. The man lowered his head, avoiding everyone's eyes. He was no longer the center of attention in the way he wanted to be. Instead, he had become an example of what not to do, a reminder of the consequences of letting bitterness and unkindness control one's actions. He was silent now, his arrogance gone, replaced by shame. After the officers finished their work, the chief gave them a simple nod. "Take it from here," he said quietly. They acknowledged him respectfully, guiding the man away without any fuss. The crowd parted slightly, watching as he walked, his steps heavy and reluctant. Children whispered to their parents, asking questions in soft voices, while parents explained gently in ways their little ones could understand. As the man disappeared from sight, a sense of relief washed over the park. Parents hugged their children a little tighter, grateful that the situation had ended without harm. The children slowly returned to their games, their laughter cautiously rising again. The park began to feel alive once more, though the memory of what had happened would linger. The chief turned his focus back to his daughter. He crouched down again so he was eye level with her. "It's over now," he told her gently. "You were very brave today." She smiled faintly, leaning forward to hug him tightly around the neck. "I was scared, Daddy," she admitted softly. He kissed her forehead and replied, "It's okay to be scared. What matters is that you faced it. And you didn't face it alone." The little girl nodded, her trust in him deeper than ever. To her, this moment was more than just a scary day, it was a reminder that her father would always be there to protect her. The other children came closer, their faces full of admiration. One of them said shyly, "Your dad is amazing." The girl smiled proudly, wiping her cheeks. "I know," she said simply. The parents in the crowd began to approach the chief, offering words of respect. "Thank you for the way you handled that," one father said. "You set such an example for all of us." Another mother added, "The way you stayed calm, our kids will remember this." "We will too." The chief shook his head humbly. "I'm just a father, like all of you. I wanted my daughter to feel safe. And I wanted every child here to know that adults should protect them, not frighten them." His humility touched the crowd even more. Though he held an important title, he didn't stand there as the chief of police. He stood there as a parent, equal to them, speaking from the heart. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse. Parents led their children back to the swings, slides, and picnic tables, reassured by what they had witnessed. The park began to sound lively again, Filled with laughter and chatter, the heavy tension finally lifted. The little girl tugged on her father's hand. "Can we stay a little longer, Daddy?" she asked quietly. He looked down at her, surprised. "You're not too scared?" She shook her head firmly. "Not if you're here." His heart warmed at her words, and he smiled. "Then we'll stay." They walked hand in hand to the grassy field where her pink ball still rested. She picked it up, dusted it off, and looked at him with a playful grin. "Will you play with me?" He laughed softly, a sound that lightened the air, and nodded. "Of course. Let's see how far you can throw it." The two of them began to toss the ball back and forth, the little girl's laughter ringing out once more. Other children soon joined in, and the field filled again with joy and freedom. The parents nearby watched with smiles, comforted by the sight of innocence returning after such a heavy afternoon. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the father knew that this day would not be forgotten. Not by his daughter, not by the parents and children who had witnessed it, and not even by the man who had tried to intimidate a child but had been silenced by truth and justice. It was a moment that showed the power of love, the importance of courage, and the strength of community. The little girl, tired but happy, finally leaned against her father as they walked home. She looked up at him sleepily and whispered, "You made everything okay?" He smiled, holding her close as they walked down the quiet path. "That's my job, sweetheart," he replied softly. "And I'll always be here to do it." And with that, the day that had begun with laughter, had turned tense with fear, ended once more with the sound of children's joy and the quiet strength of a father's love.